Welcome, fellow travelers of infinite possibilities, to the complete exploration of Rick and Morty's deepest mysteries and most compelling theories. Tonight, we journey through the labyrinthine corridors of interdimensional speculation, examining the hidden truths behind Adult Swim's most complex animated universe. Settle comfortably as we drift through theories both profound and paradoxical, letting these contemplations of genius, family, and cosmic horror wash over you like portal fluid through the multiverse. There's no need to solve every mystery. Simply allow these explorations of Rick's tortured psyche and the show's infinite depths carry you toward peaceful rest. The question of Rick Sanchez's genius has captivated fans since the very first episode of the series, when a seemingly straightforward adventure to collect interdimensional seeds revealed layers of complexity that would reshape our understanding of intelligence, dependency, and the fragile boundaries between natural ability and artificial enhancement. The theory that Rick's legendary intellect may not be entirely his own represents one of the most psychologically disturbing possibilities in a show already renowned for its willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the costs of power. The evidence begins in the pilot episode with what appears to be a simple detail about Rick's constant companion, the metallic flask he carries wherever he travels across dimensions. Most viewers initially accepted the obvious explanation that Rick's flask contains alcohol, supporting his characterization as a functioning alcoholic whose brilliant mind operates despite, or perhaps because of constant intoxication. The frequent burping, slurred speech, and erratic behavior all seem to confirm this interpretation, creating the familiar archetype of the brilliant but self-destructive genius whose vices are inseparable from his gifts. However, careful observation reveals a crucial distinction that undermines this straightforward reading of Rick's relationship with substances. Throughout the series, whenever Rick consumes what is clearly meant to be alcohol, drinks from bottles marked with 3X symbols, beverages from red Solo cups at parties, or any container explicitly identified as containing liquor, his behavior becomes noticeably more impaired than his baseline level of intoxication. These moments of genuine drunkenness stand in stark contrast to his normal state when drinking from his unmarked silver flask, suggesting that whatever fills his constant companion serves a different purpose entirely. The mega seeds that Rick and Morty collect in the pilot episode provide the key to understanding this distinction. When Rick explains the properties of these interdimensional fruits to his grandson, he reveals that the seeds contain compounds capable of dramatically enhancing human intelligence, albeit temporarily and with significant side effects. Morty's brief experience with the seeds demonstrates their power. A 14-year-old boy, with acknowledged learning difficulties, suddenly possesses the mathematical and scientific knowledge to recite complex formulas and understand advanced theoretical concepts that would challenge graduate students. The physical manifestations of the seed's influence on Morty prove particularly revealing when examined alongside Rick's constant behavioral patterns. The distinctive drooling that accompanies Morty's enhanced state matches exactly the perpetual saliva that characterizes Rick's appearance throughout the series. This cannot be mere coincidence in a show where every visual detail serves narrative purpose and where the creators have demonstrated meticulous attention to consistency in character design and behavior patterns across multiple seasons and dimensions. Rick's confession that he has used the seeds himself, smuggling them through interdimensional customs so many times that they would simply fall out if he attempted to carry them internally again, takes on new significance when viewed through this theoretical framework. His casual admission of repeated seed transportation suggests not occasional recreational use, but rather systematic harvesting and processing of the compounds for ongoing consumption. The implication that Rick has developed a tolerance to the seed's placement effects, but continues to benefit from their cognitive enhancement properties, points toward a carefully maintained regimen rather than sporadic experimentation. The timing of Rick's flask consumption provides additional evidence for this theory. Rick's sips from his unmarked container occur most frequently during moments requiring peak intellectual performance, complex calculations, rapid problem-solving under pressure, or the creation of sophisticated inventions from available materials. These moments of apparent liquid courage or stress relief may actually represent strategic dosing to maintain optimal cognitive function during challenging tasks that demand his full intellectual capabilities. The psychological implications of Rick's potential dependence on artificial intelligence enhancement extend far beyond simple addiction or substance abuse. If Rick's legendary status as the smartest man in the universe depends even partially on consistent consumption of processed megaseeds, then his entire identity becomes contingent on access to interdimensional resources and his ability to maintain a complex chemical regimen. This dependency would explain his paranoid protection of his supply sources and his willingness to expose Morty to significant danger and humiliation to ensure continued access to the necessary materials. The existential crisis that such dependence would create for someone of Rick's ego and self-perception cannot be overstated. Rick's intellectual superiority serves as the foundation for his worldview, his treatment of others, and his justification for the casual cruelty and manipulation that characterize his interactions with family and strangers alike. The possibility that his genius requires artificial maintenance would undermine not just his confidence, but the philosophical framework he has constructed to make sense of his place in the universe and his relationships with other people. This theory also provides new context for Rick's complex relationship with other versions of himself across the multiverse. The Council of Ricks and the broader Citadel of Ricks represent communities of individuals who share Rick's basic personality and intellectual potential, yet display varying degrees of success and capability. If access to megaseeds creates artificial hierarchies among naturally equivalent individuals, then the social stratification visible within the Citadel takes on more sinister implications as a system where chemical advantage, rather than inherent merit, determines status and power. The megaseeds theory offers a potential explanation for Rick's unique position among his alternate selves as the so-called Rickest Rick. His early discovery of the seeds and development of processing techniques may have provided him with advantages that other Ricks lack, enabling him to achieve technological breakthroughs and accumulate knowledge at accelerated rates. This head start would compound over time, creating the appearance of natural superiority while masking the artificial foundation of his enhanced capabilities. Rick's relationship with Morty gains additional layers of manipulation and dependency when viewed through this theoretical lens. Morty's utility as a brainwave camouflage device may be secondary to his value as an unwitting accomplice in maintaining Rick's supply chain of cognitive enhancement materials. The adventures that expose Morty to danger and trauma serve Rick's intellectual needs as much as they provide entertainment or education, creating a parasitic dynamic where the grandson's welfare becomes subordinate to the grandfather's chemical requirements. The moral implications of Rick's potential artificial enhancement become even more troubling when considered alongside his treatment of his family and his casual disregard for the welfare of beings across multiple dimensions. If Rick's intellectual achievements rest on a foundation of chemical dependency rather than natural ability, then his assumption of superiority over others loses whatever ethical justification it might have possessed. His godlike technological capabilities become the result of systematic cheating rather than earned expertise, transforming his arrogance from misguided pride into deliberate fraud. The theory also casts new light on Rick's frequent proclamations about the meaninglessness of existence and the futility of moral considerations. A Rick who depends on artificial enhancement for his intellectual achievements might develop nihilistic philosophy, not from genuine cosmic insight, but from the psychological defense mechanisms necessary to cope with the knowledge of his own fraudulent nature. His dismissal of conventional morality and emotional attachment could represent attempts to avoid confronting the ethical implications of building his identity on deception and dependency. The withdrawal symptoms that would inevitably accompany any interruption in Rick's hypothetical megaseed regimen provide another avenue for understanding his behavior patterns and psychological state. The depression, irritability, and self-destructive tendencies that characterize Rick's baseline emotional condition may reflect the chronic effects of managing chemical dependency while maintaining the facade of natural genius. His alcoholism could represent attempts to self-medicate the psychological distress created by living with such a fundamental deception about his own capabilities. The technological marvels that Rick creates with apparent ease take on different significance when viewed as the products of chemically enhanced rather than naturally gifted intelligence. His portal gun, his various inventions, and his ability to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality might represent achievements that would be impossible for his unenhanced baseline intelligence to accomplish. This dependency would make his technological superiority both more impressive as an artificial achievement and more fragile as a capability that could be lost if his supply chain were ever compromised. The relationship between Rick's flask consumption and his emotional state provides additional evidence for the artificial enhancement theory. Rick's most vulnerable moments often coincide with periods when he might be unable to maintain his usual chemical regimen during imprisonment, extended adventures in dimensions without access to his supplies, or situations where his flask is damaged or lost. These circumstances consistently reveal a Rick who appears diminished, not just emotionally but intellectually, struggling with problems that his enhanced self would solve effortlessly. The systematic nature of Rick's approach to collecting and processing megaseeds suggests a level of planning and preparation that extends far beyond casual recreational use. His knowledge of optimal harvesting techniques, storage methods, and processing procedures indicates extensive research and experimentation with the seed's properties. This dedication to understanding and optimizing his enhancement regimen points towards someone who has built his entire lifestyle and identity around maintaining artificial cognitive advantages. The implications for Rick's legacy and his impact on the multiverse become profoundly different when viewed through the lens of artificial enhancement. His technological contributions to interdimensional science and his influence on the development of portal travel technology may represent achievements that no naturally gifted individual could have accomplished without chemical assistance. This raises questions about the sustainability of the technological civilization that Rick has helped create, and the consequences that might follow if other beings discovered the artificial foundation of his capabilities. As we drift deeper into contemplation of Rick's possible dependence on artificial intelligence enhancement, the theory reveals itself as more than speculation about fictional science. It becomes a meditation on the nature of achievement, identity, and the lengths to which brilliant individuals might go to maintain advantages they fear losing. The comfort of assuming that genius is natural and permanent gives way to the more unsettling recognition that even the most extraordinary capabilities may depend on factors beyond individual control, creating vulnerabilities that no amount of intelligence can entirely eliminate. The The central finite curve represents perhaps the most audacious and psychologically revealing achievement in Rick Sanchez's long career of bending reality to his will, yet it also stands as the ultimate expression of his deepest insecurities and his fundamental inability to accept the possibility of his own intellectual limitations. This dimensional barrier, constructed through mathematical principles that exceed the comprehension of most beings across infinite realities, serves simultaneously as Rick's greatest technological triumph and his most elaborate psychological prison, trapping not only himself but countless billions of innocent beings within carefully curated versions of existence, designed to preserve his fragile sense of cosmic significance. The theoretical framework required to identify and isolate all dimensions where Rick Sanchez represents the pinnacle of intellectual achievement would challenge the processing capabilities of entire civilizations dedicated to interdimensional mathematics. The project would have demanded Rick survey infinite realities, categorize them according to complex criteria that placed his own cognitive abilities at the center of universal importance, and then construct barriers capable of separating these selected dimensions from the broader multiverse, with sufficient precision to prevent any contamination from realities where his intellectual supremacy might be challenged or disproven. The psychological motivations underlying such an enormous undertaking reveal the profound insecurity that drives even Rick's most impressive scientific accomplishments. The man who claims to view existence as meaningless and dismisses conventional values as arbitrary constructs has invested immeasurable time and resources in ensuring that he will never encounter evidence of his own limitations or failure. The central finite curve serves as a cosmic-scale security blanket, protecting Rick from the existential anxiety that would accompany the discovery that infinite versions of reality contain beings far more intelligent, creative, or accomplished than himself. The construction process itself would have required Rick to confront the very possibilities he sought to eliminate, as identifying dimensions where he was not the smartest being would necessitate observing and analyzing realities where his intellectual superiority was absent or irrelevant. The psychological toll of witnessing infinite variations of existence where other minds surpassed his own capabilities would have been devastating for someone whose entire identity rests on assumptions about his unique genius. The completion of the curve represents not just technological mastery, but also Rick's successful repression of traumatic knowledge about his own cosmic insignificance. The ethical implications of condemning entire populations to existence within Rick's curated version of reality extend far beyond individual suffering to encompass systematic oppression on a scale that dwarfs any atrocity committed by conventional tyrants or galactic empires. Every Rick, Morty, Beth, Jerry, and Summer living within the central finite curve exists as an unwilling participant in Rick's psychological experiment, their lives constrained by boundaries they cannot perceive and choices they cannot make, because Rick's need for validation requires their realities to conform to his specifications about intellectual hierarchy and cosmic order. The billions of Mortys who suffer abuse, abandonment, and exploitation at the hands of their respective Ricks across the curve-enclosed dimensions represent perhaps the most tragic consequence of Rick's need for intellectual supremacy. These variations of his grandson endure trauma not because of individual Rick's cruelty, but because the fundamental structure of their realities has been predetermined to ensure that Rick-like beings always occupy positions of superior knowledge and power. Their suffering serves no purpose beyond maintaining Rick's comfort with his own self-image. The citadel of Ricks, with its complex social hierarchies and systematic oppression of Mortys, represents the logical endpoint of Rick's dimensional curation project, When infinite versions of the same personality are confined within realities designed to reinforce their intellectual superiority, the result is not harmony, but rather increasingly sophisticated forms of exploitation and control. As each Rick attempts to distinguish himself from his alternatives through the exercise of power over those deemed inferior, the Citadel's dysfunction reflects the inherent contradictions in Rick's philosophy of intelligence-based supremacy. Evil Morty's discovery of the central finite curve's existence transforms his character from local antagonist to cosmic liberator, someone who has recognized the true scope of Rick's oppression and dedicated himself to breaking the dimensional prison that constrains infinite populations for the benefit of one being's psychological comfort. His presentation of this information to Rick and Morty reveals not just technical knowledge but moral clarity about the fundamental injustice of Rick's greatest achievement, forcing both characters and audience to confront the reality that Rick's protection of his ego has required systematic violation of universal principles of freedom and self-determination. The mathematical elegance of the central finite curve's construction cannot disguise the profound moral bankruptcy of its purpose. Rick has essentially created a universe-sized echo chamber where every reflection confirms his preconceptions about his own importance while eliminating any voice that might challenge his self-perception. The technological sophistication required to accomplish this feat makes the underlying insecurity and need for validation all the more pathetic, revealing Rick as someone whose godlike capabilities are employed primarily in service of maintaining childish delusions about his unique specialness. The revelation that Rick has spent decades or perhaps centuries living within this artificial bubble of validation recontextualizes every adventure and achievement shown in the series. His casual dismissal of conventional morality, his treatment of family members as expendable resources, and his assumption that his perspective represents objective truth all take on different meanings when understood as the products of systematic exposure to realities designed to reinforce his biases rather than challenge his assumptions or broaden his understanding of possible perspectives on existence. The psychological dependence that the central finite curve creates for Rick extends beyond simple comfort with familiar circumstances to encompass fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and his place within it. Having lived for so long within dimensions where his intellectual superiority is guaranteed, Rick has lost the capacity to function effectively in contexts where his knowledge might be incomplete or his problem-solving approaches might prove inadequate. The curve has not just protected him from external challenges, but has also atrophied his ability to adapt to genuinely unexpected circumstances. The destruction of the central finite curve by evil Morty represents not just the elimination of dimensional barriers, but the collapse of the entire framework that has structured Rick's understanding of himself and his relationships with others. The sudden exposure to infinite realities where his intelligence might be ordinary or inadequate creates an existential crisis that no amount of technological capability can resolve, forcing Rick to confront questions about identity and worth that he has successfully avoided for decades through careful curation of his experiential environment. The aftermath of the curve's destruction leaves Rick vulnerable to forms of accountability and consequence that his previous isolation had eliminated. The beings he has harmed across the enclosed dimensions, the civilizations he has disrupted, and the families he has destroyed through his casual interventions may now have access to realities where Rick's protection and advantages are absent, creating possibilities for justice or revenge that Rick's former status as the smartest being in any accessible universe had previously rendered impossible. The broader implications of the central finite curve's existence extend beyond Rick's personal psychology to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, achievement, and moral responsibility in contexts where unlimited power meets profound insecurity. Rick's ability to reshape reality itself according to his psychological needs demonstrates the danger inherent in combining advanced technological capability with unresolved emotional trauma and narcissistic personality traits that prevent healthy relationships with equals or superiors. The parallel between Rick's dimensional prison and his emotional barriers with his family becomes apparent when examining how both serve to protect him from experiences that might challenge his self-perception or force him to acknowledge his own limitations and failures. Just as the central finite curve prevents Rick from encountering beings more intelligent than himself, his emotional detachment and philosophical nihilism prevent him from forming relationships that might require him to consider other perspectives as equally valid or to acknowledge his own need for connection and support from others. The tragedy of the central finite curve lies not just in the suffering it causes to trapped populations, but in its ultimate futility as a solution to Rick's underlying psychological problems. The artificial validation provided by guaranteed intellectual superiority cannot address the fundamental emptiness and isolation that drive Rick's need for such validation in the first place. The curve may have eliminated external challenges to Rick's ego, but it has also eliminated opportunities for genuine growth, connection, and the development of more authentic sources of self-worth based on character rather than comparative advantage. The technological legacy of the central finite curve raises disturbing questions about the nature of scientific achievement when divorced from ethical consideration or emotional maturity. Rick's ability to manipulate the fundamental structure of reality itself represents the pinnacle of scientific capability, yet its application in service of petty psychological needs demonstrates how even the most advanced knowledge can be corrupted by unresolved personal trauma and the inability to accept one's own limitations and vulnerability as natural aspects of conscious existence. As we contemplate the full implications of Rick's self-imposed dimensional prison, the central finite curve reveals itself as more than a plot device or science fiction concept. It becomes a meditation on the ways that privilege and power can be used to avoid the difficult but necessary work of psychological growth and moral development. The comfort of artificial superiority gives way to the recognition that genuine strength comes from the ability to acknowledge one's limitations while still choosing to act with compassion and wisdom within the constraints of finite knowledge and capability. The theory that evil Morty represents Rick Cone 37's original grandson stands as one of the most psychologically devastating possibilities in a series already renowned for its unflinching examination of how trauma perpetuates itself across generations and dimensions. This interpretation transforms evil Morty from a simple antagonist into a living monument to Rick's greatest failure as both protector and mentor, a twisted reflection of what happens when infinite power meets the vulnerable mind of a child who trusts completely in the wisdom and benevolence of his grandfather. The photographic evidence that haunts Rick's memories provides the first crucial piece of this tragic puzzle. The images of Rick holding an infant Morty, teaching a young child to walk, sharing moments of apparent tenderness and connection, cannot exist within the established timeline of Rick's 20-year absence from Beth's life, unless they originate from a different dimensional context entirely. These memories represent not fabricated scenarios designed to manipulate alien interrogators, but genuine experiences from Rick's past, with a grandson who once looked at him with the same trust and affection that our current Morty displays during their early adventures. The systematic corruption of an innocent child through exposure to Rick's worldview and methods represents a form of psychological abuse so subtle and gradual that neither perpetrator nor victim might recognize its occurrence until the damage had become irreversible. Rick's approach to education has always involved exposing Morty to extreme situations, dangerous environments, and moral complexities that would challenge the psychological resilience of trained adults, let alone a developing adolescent whose understanding of right and wrong is still forming through observation of trusted authority figures. The original Morty's transformation from trusting grandson to manipulative mastermind would have occurred through incremental desensitization to violence, casual disregard for the welfare of others, and the gradual internalization of Rick's nihilistic philosophy that reduces all existence to variables in equations designed to produce desired outcomes. Each adventure that normalized cruelty, each lesson that emphasized intellectual superiority over emotional connection, each demonstration that other beings existed primarily as resources to be exploited would have contributed to the erosion of natural empathy and moral intuition that characterizes healthy human development. The intelligence that evil Morty displays throughout his appearances suggests exposure to Rick's teaching methods over an extended period, allowing him to absorb not just factual knowledge, but also Rick's approaches to problem solving, strategic thinking, and the manipulation of complex systems. This educational process would have required years of close collaboration between grandfather and grandson, creating intimate bonds of trust and affection that would make the eventual betrayal and abandonment all the more traumatic for both parties involved. Rick's memories of conducting horrific experiments on a young Morty, shown during Evil Rick's interrogation sequence, take on new significance when viewed as documentation of the systematic abuse that transformed Rick's original grandson into something capable of matching his own capacity for cruelty and manipulation. These scenes represent not abstract torture of random subjects, but the deliberate conditioning of someone Rick claimed to love, using pain and fear as tools for education in the same way that less extreme versions of his teaching methods continue to shape our current Morty's development. The breaking point that led to evil Morty's rebellion against Rick would have represented the moment when the student recognized that he had surpassed his teacher not in wisdom or benevolence, but in the very qualities that Rick claimed to despise in others: the willingness to cause suffering for personal gain, the reduction of other beings to expendable resources, and the complete abandonment of ethical considerations in pursuit of power and control. This recognition would have been accompanied by the devastating realization that Rick had deliberately shaped him into a monster while maintaining the pretense of protection and guidance. Evil Morty's subsequent campaign against Rick and the broader Rick-dominated multiverse reflects not simple revenge, but a systematic attempt to prevent other versions of himself from experiencing the same corruption and abandonment that defined his own development. His torture of Morty serves the dual purpose of creating practical camouflage for his activities, while also forcing other versions of his former self to confront the reality of their situation as expendable tools in Rick's various schemes and experiments. The political sophistication that evil Morty demonstrates during his rise to power within the Citadel suggests not just intelligence but also deep understanding of how systems of oppression function and how they can be manipulated to serve the interests of those who understand their underlying mechanisms. This knowledge could only have been acquired through direct experience with Rick's methods of control and through observation of how Rick maintains dominance over family members, enemies, and entire civilizations through carefully calibrated combinations of protection and threat. The psychological profile of evil Morty reveals someone who has retained Rick's analytical capabilities while developing emotional responses that Rick has suppressed or eliminated entirely through alcohol, nihilistic philosophy, and deliberate isolation from meaningful relationships. Evil Morty's anger at his abandonment and abuse represents the healthy, emotional reaction that Rick himself should have experienced, but was unable to process due to his own psychological limitations and defense mechanisms. The timeline implications of Rick Cone 37's relationship with evil Morty require Rick's departure from his original dimension following the breakdown of their relationship, leaving behind not just a corrupted grandson, but also the dimensional context where his greatest failure as a mentor and protector occurred. Rick's arrival in Dimension Cone 37 and his assumption of the dead or absent Rick's identity represents his attempt to start over with a new family, applying lessons learned from his previous failure, while still retaining the fundamental character flaws that made such failure inevitable. The systematic nature of evil Morty's campaign against Rick suggests long-term planning that began shortly after Rick's abandonment, indicating that evil Morty spent years or decades developing the knowledge and resources necessary to track down his former mentor across multiple dimensions. This dedication to revenge demonstrates the depth of psychological damage caused by Rick's betrayal, transforming natural love and trust into an equally powerful force for destruction and retribution. Evil Morty's success in manipulating the Citadel's political system reveals understanding of Rick's psychology that extends beyond his personal experience with one particular Rick to encompass insights into the fundamental insecurities and motivations that drive all versions of Rick Sanchez across the multiverse. This knowledge could only have been acquired through intimate familiarity with Rick's thought processes, emotional triggers, and the methods he uses to maintain psychological equilibrium in the face of cosmic meaninglessness and interpersonal isolation. The technological sophistication of evil Morty's schemes, from his control of evil Rick to his manipulation of the Citadel's infrastructure, demonstrates not just intelligence, but also access to advanced scientific knowledge that normal Mortys should not possess. This expertise represents the positive legacy of Rick's teaching, showing that evil Morty absorbed genuine scientific understanding, along with the moral corruption that ultimately defined their relationship. The destruction of the central finite curve represents evil Morty's ultimate rejection of the entire framework that enabled Rick's abuse and abandonment, eliminating not just the barriers that protected Rick from consequences, but also the fundamental assumptions about intelligence-based hierarchy that justified treating other beings as expendable resources. This act of cosmic liberation serves as both personal revenge and humanitarian intervention, freeing infinite populations from Rick's systematic oppression. Rick's warning to our current Morty about the dangers of becoming cocky takes on prophetic significance when understood as advice based on direct experience with a previous Morty who developed beyond normal limitations and posed a genuine threat to Rick's authority and control. The cutting away to evil Morty's activities immediately following this warning creates narrative parallel that suggests evil Morty represents the fulfillment of Rick's fears about what happens when Mortys evolve beyond their designated roles as submissive companions and intellectual camouflage. The cyclical nature of trauma that evil Morty's story illustrates extends beyond individual psychology to encompass broader questions about how systems of oppression perpetuate themselves across generations and dimensions. Rick's creation of evil Morty represents not just personal failure, but also the inevitable result of treating relationships as opportunities for control rather than genuine connection, demonstrating how the exercise of power over vulnerable individuals ultimately creates enemies capable of matching or exceeding the original oppressor's capacity for harm. The possibility that our current Morty might follow a similar trajectory toward rebellion and corruption adds layers of tension and meaning to his ongoing relationship with Rick, transforming their adventures from simple entertainment into a complex psychological drama where every lesson Rick teaches and every trauma he inflicts carries the potential to recreate the conditions that produced his greatest enemy. The question of whether Rick has learned from his previous failure or remains trapped in patterns of behavior that make such failure inevitable becomes central to understanding the long-term implications of their relationship. Evil Morty's final escape into the broader multiverse, beyond the central finite curve, represents not just personal liberation, but also the introduction of someone with intimate knowledge of Rick's methods and weaknesses into realities where Rick's technological and intellectual advantages may not provide adequate protection. This development creates existential anxiety for Rick that transcends normal concerns about physical safety to encompass fundamental questions about his ability to maintain security and autonomy in contexts where his former victim has become a peer competitor with superior motivation and clearer moral purpose. As we contemplate the tragic transformation of Rick's original grandson from innocent child into cosmic-scale threat, Evil Morty's story reveals itself as more than speculative fiction about interdimensional conflict. It becomes a meditation on the ways that love can be corrupted into control, protection can become abuse, and the failure to acknowledge one's own limitations can create the very enemies we most fear to face. The simulation episode of Rick and Morty serves as more than entertainment or science fiction spectacle. It functions as a philosophical examination of the nature of reality itself and the terrifying possibility that conscious experience may be nothing more than elaborate deception designed to serve purposes we cannot comprehend or control. The layers of virtual environments that Rick and Jerry navigate during their alien captivity create a metaphysical puzzle that extends far beyond the boundaries of their fictional universe to encompass fundamental questions about perception, authenticity, and the reliability of memory and experience as guides to truth. The initial revelation that Morty exists only as a simulation within the alien virtual reality system establishes the first crack in the foundation of assumed reality, forcing both characters and viewers to question the authenticity of relationships and experiences that had seemed genuine and meaningful. The casual way that Rick dismisses the simulated Morty as a mere fabrication highlights his ability to distinguish between authentic and artificial relationships, suggesting familiarity with virtual environments that might extend beyond this particular encounter with alien technology. Jerry's accidental inclusion in the simulation adds layers of complexity to the virtual environment that the alien interrogators had not anticipated, creating variables and interactions that their carefully designed psychological manipulation protocols were not equipped to handle effectively. His presence serves as both comic relief and philosophical anchor, representing the kind of mundane human concerns and relationships that persist even within artificial realities, designed to extract information through elaborate deception and psychological manipulation. The nested structure of simulations within simulations reveals the sophisticated nature of the alien technology, while simultaneously demonstrating the psychological principle that conscious minds will adapt to and accept virtually any consistent set of environmental conditions as authentic reality. Each layer of virtual experience that Rick and Jerry escape appears to offer genuine freedom and authentic existence until the next revelation exposes it as merely another level of deception designed to maintain the illusion of progress, while keeping the subjects contained within controlled parameters. The philosophical implications of infinite regression in virtual environments challenge basic assumptions about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of ever achieving certain knowledge about the authenticity of experience. If reality can be simulated convincingly enough to fool even highly intelligent and suspicious subjects, then the distinction between genuine and artificial experience becomes meaningless, reducing all conscious awareness to subjective phenomena that cannot be verified through external reference points or objective criteria. Rick's apparent familiarity with simulation technology and his confidence in navigating virtual environments suggest previous exposure to artificial realities that may have been more extensive than the episode explicitly reveals. His casual references to the limitations and characteristics of simulated experiences imply understanding based on practical knowledge rather than theoretical speculation, raising questions about the extent to which his own adventures and relationships might have occurred within controlled virtual contexts designed by entities with purposes he has not yet discovered or understood. The bootstrap paradox that emerges from the possibility of nested simulations extends beyond technical considerations to encompass existential questions about the foundation of identity and memory in contexts where experience itself cannot be trusted as a reliable source of information about personal history or authentic relationships. If memories can be implanted and experiences can be fabricated with sufficient sophistication to fool conscious awareness, then the continuity of personal identity becomes suspect and the meaning of individual choice becomes questionable. The Matrix-like environment that Rick and Jerry discover upon their apparent escape from the alien simulation system reveals a vast infrastructure dedicated to maintaining virtual realities for numerous subjects from different species and dimensional contexts. The scope of this operation suggests not casual experimentation but systematic harvesting of information or consciousness from beings across the multiverse, indicating that simulation technology may be far more prevalent and sophisticated than most beings realize or acknowledge. The specific creature that receives focus during the escape sequence, later appearing in Jerry's Pluto adventure, serves as potential evidence that the simulation experience created lasting connections between virtual and authentic realities in ways that the alien technology may not have intended or predicted. This crossover between simulated and genuine experience blurs the boundaries between artificial and authentic relationships, suggesting that consciousness may be capable of forming meaningful connections even within deliberately deceptive virtual environments. Rick's casual attitude toward the possibility of remaining permanently trapped within alien simulations reflects his broader philosophical stance that the distinction between authentic and artificial experience may be less important than the ability to achieve desired outcomes and maintain personal autonomy regardless of the underlying nature of reality. This perspective allows him to function effectively, even when fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence cannot be verified or trusted through conventional means. The psychological impact on Jerry of discovering that significant portions of his experience were artificially generated demonstrates the emotional trauma that accompanies the recognition that memory and perception cannot be trusted as reliable guides to truth. His struggle to distinguish between authentic and simulated experiences reflects the broader human need for certainty about the reality of relationships and achievements that provide meaning and structure to individual existence. The alien interrogator's failure to extract the information they sought, despite sophisticated virtual reality technology, suggests that Rick's consciousness possesses characteristics that make it resistant to conventional forms of psychological manipulation and artificial environment control. This resistance may stem from his extensive experience with interdimensional travel and exposure to realities with fundamentally different physical and logical principles, creating mental flexibility that enables adaptation to virtually any consistent set of environmental conditions. The theoretical possibility that Rick and Jerry remain trapped within simulation layers that they have not yet recognized or escaped adds retroactive uncertainty to every subsequent adventure and relationship shown in the series. This interpretation transforms all later episodes into potential virtual experiences designed to maintain the illusion of freedom while continuing to extract information or serve purposes that the subjects cannot perceive or understand from their limited perspectives within controlled environments. The show's frequent breaks of the fourth wall and references to its own fictional nature take on new significance when viewed through the lens of simulation theory, suggesting that Rick's awareness of being a cartoon character might represent recognition that his reality is artificially constructed rather than naturally occurring. This metatextual interpretation creates recursive loops of meaning, where Rick's fictional awareness becomes evidence for his existence within simulated rather than authentic reality contexts. The comfort that simulation theory provides for viewers dealing with the show's more disturbing elements reveals the psychological appeal of believing that extreme violence and cruelty might be artificial constructs rather than genuine expressions of character, psychology, and moral choice. The possibility that Rick's worst actions occur within virtual environments designed to test psychological responses allows audiences to maintain affection for characters whose authentic behavior might be morally reprehensible. The technical limitations of simulation technology demonstrated throughout the episode suggest that even highly advanced virtual reality systems cannot perfectly replicate the complexity and unpredictability of authentic conscious experience. The glitches, inconsistencies, and unexpected developments that occur within the alien simulations indicate that artificial realities remain distinguishable from genuine experience for sufficiently observant and suspicious subjects. The broader implications of widespread simulation use across the multiverse raise questions about the nature of consciousness itself and the possibility that what individuals experience as authentic personal identity might represent artificial constructs maintained by entities with purposes and perspectives that transcend individual understanding. This interpretation reduces personal agency to the execution of predetermined scripts within controlled environments designed to produce specific outcomes for unknown observers. The recursive nature of simulation within simulation creates infinite regress problems that challenge the logical foundation of reality itself, suggesting that the search for authentic experience and genuine truth may be fundamentally misguided if consciousness itself exists within layered artificial constructs that extend beyond the perceptual capabilities of individual subjects. This philosophical vertigo mirrors the disorientation that Rick and Jerry experience as they navigate increasingly complex levels of virtual deception. The emotional authenticity of relationships formed within simulated environments raises profound questions about the nature of love, friendship, and family bonds when the contexts that create and sustain these connections cannot be verified as genuine rather than artificially constructed. The possibility that meaningful relationships might develop between subjects who exist within controlled virtual realities suggests that consciousness may be capable of creating authentic value, even within deliberately deceptive contexts. As we drift through contemplation of infinite layers of possible simulation, the episode reveals itself as more than science fiction entertainment. It becomes a meditation on the fundamental uncertainty that accompanies conscious existence in any context where perception might be manipulated and experience might be artificially generated for purposes beyond individual understanding or control. The search for authentic reality gives way to acceptance that meaning and value may emerge from conscious experience regardless of its ultimate foundation in genuine or simulated environmental contexts. The Smith family's dysfunction extends far beyond typical domestic discord to encompass systematic patterns of manipulation, emotional abuse, and toxic codependency that reflect Rick's complete inability to form healthy relationships with people he claims to love and protect. The orchestrated destruction of Beth and Jerry's marriage represents perhaps Rick's most calculated exercise in family control, demonstrating how his superior intelligence and technological capabilities can be weaponized against the very people who should be able to trust him most completely and without reservation. Rick's strategic manipulation of Beth and Jerry's divorce reveals the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that enables his dominance over family relationships through carefully calibrated combinations of emotional manipulation and practical intervention. His timing of confessions about his role in orchestrating their separation, delivered to Morty immediately after his dramatic escape from Galactic Federation prison, demonstrates his confidence that his heroic status would make his admissions seem like strategic brilliance rather than cruel manipulation of vulnerable family members during periods of extreme stress and uncertainty. The systematic erosion of Jerry's position within the family structure serves multiple strategic purposes beyond simple elimination of opposition to Rick's authority and influence. Jerry's removal eliminates the primary voice for conventional morality and emotional stability within the household, while also demonstrating to other family members the consequences of challenging Rick's decisions or expressing disapproval of his methods and priorities. The casual way Rick orchestrates Jerry's exclusion reveals his understanding that family loyalty can be manipulated through strategic creation of circumstances that force other members to choose sides in conflicts he has deliberately engineered. Beth's complicity in her husband's removal from the family unit reflects the complex psychological dependency that Rick has cultivated through years of intermittent presence and abandonment, creating attachment patterns that prioritize his approval over the stability and welfare of her own nuclear family. Her willingness to choose her father over her husband demonstrates the success of Rick's long-term strategy of positioning himself as the primary source of validation and identity within Beth's emotional landscape, making his continued presence feel essential to her psychological well-being and self-worth. The impact of Rick's family manipulation on Summer and Morty reveals the intergenerational transmission of trauma and dysfunction that occurs when parental figures prioritize their own psychological needs over the developmental requirements of children who depend on stable, nurturing relationships for healthy, emotional growth. Summer's existential crisis about her own significance across multiple dimensions reflects the broader uncertainty about identity and meaning that Rick's influence introduces into the family system through his casual attitude toward dimensional replacement and the disposability of individual relationships. The Beth clone theory adds layers of disturbing complexity to Rick's relationship with his daughter, suggesting that his willingness to provide her with technological solutions to emotional dilemmas may extend to creating artificial versions of family members when their authentic selves become inconvenient or problematic. The possibility that Rick might replace his daughter with a more compliant artificial duplicate reveals the ultimate expression of his need to control family relationships, even when such control requires eliminating the authentic personalities and independent agency that make relationships meaningful rather than merely functional. Rick's selective memory erasure of whether Beth chose to be cloned demonstrates his recognition that maintaining emotional investment in family relationships requires him to preserve some illusion of authenticity and genuine choice. even when his actions systematically undermine the conditions that would make such authenticity possible. The deliberate amnesia he imposes on himself allows him to experience parental emotions toward Beth, while avoiding the psychological consequences of knowing that those emotions might be directed toward an artificial construct created to satisfy his own preferences about how family relationships should function. The psychological profile of a father who would offer his daughter the option of abandoning her family responsibilities through technological duplication reveals the profound moral blindness that accompanies Rick's approach to solving interpersonal problems through scientific innovation rather than emotional growth and genuine communication. His presentation of the clone option as liberation from artificial constraints ignores the reality that parental obligations represent meaningful commitments that shape character and provide opportunities for personal development through service to others who depend on adult guidance and protection. Jerry's role as the family scapegoat serves Rick's psychological needs by providing a target for displaced anger and contempt, while simultaneously offering other family members an example of what happens to those who challenge Rick's authority or question his methods. The systematic humiliation and exclusion that Jerry experiences creates an atmosphere of fear and compliance within the household, encouraging other family members to suppress their own doubts and criticisms, rather than risk similar treatment from someone whose technological capabilities make conventional forms of resistance or self-protection ineffective. The religious undertones of Morty's role as Rick's shield transform their grandfather-grandson relationship into a twisted form of sacrifice and devotion, where Morty's suffering and trauma serve the higher purpose of enabling Rick's continued existence and activities across multiple dimensions. This dynamic mirrors abusive religious systems where individual welfare is subordinated to abstract principles or the needs of authority figures who claim special knowledge or divine purpose that justifies their exploitation of vulnerable followers. The intergenerational trauma cycle within the Smith family reflects broader patterns of dysfunction that occur when parents use their children to meet emotional needs that should be addressed through adult relationships or professional, therapeutic intervention. Rick's use of his family as sources of validation, targets for displaced anger, and instruments for achieving personal goals prevents the development of healthy boundaries and mutual respect that characterize functional family systems, where individual growth and autonomy are supported rather than suppressed. The question of whether Rick's love for his family represents genuine emotional attachment or strategic maintenance of relationships that serve his psychological needs becomes central to understanding the moral implications of his protective behaviors and controlling interventions. The systematic way he manipulates family dynamics to ensure their continued dependence on his guidance and protection suggests that his affection may be contaminated by narcissistic needs for admiration and control that prevent the development of relationships based on mutual respect and authentic concern for others' independent welfare and development. Beth's struggle with her own capacity for cruelty and moral flexibility, revealed through Rick's casual cataloging of dangerous inventions he created for her childhood entertainment, demonstrates how parental influence can shape character development in ways that compromise children's natural empathy and ethical intuition. Her recognition that she shares Rick's potential for casual destruction creates identity confusion that makes her more dependent on his guidance, while also highlighting the transgenerational transmission of character flaws and moral blindness. The family's repeated dimensional replacements and assumption of dead counterparts' identities create profound questions about the continuity of relationships and the authenticity of emotional bonds when the people involved may not be the same individuals who originally formed those connections. The casual way that family members adapt to living as replacements for their deceased alternate selves suggests a disturbing flexibility about identity and attachment that reflects Rick's influence on their understanding of what constitutes genuine human connection. Summer's adolescent perspective on family dysfunction provides insights into the long-term developmental consequences of growing up within Rick's sphere of influence, where normal teenage challenges are complicated by exposure to cosmic-scale violence and the constant possibility of dimensional displacement or replacement. Her questions about Rick's motivations and methods reveal the natural moral intuition that Rick's presence threatens to corrupt through normalization of extreme behaviors and philosophical frameworks that reduce human relationships to strategic considerations. The neighborhood context within which the Smith family operates creates additional layers of deception and performance, as Rick must maintain the appearance of normalcy while conducting activities that would attract unwanted attention from authorities or neighbors who lack his technological capabilities and interdimensional perspective. The strain of maintaining dual identities as both ordinary suburban family and cosmic adventurers creates psychological pressure that contributes to the family's internal dysfunction and instability. Rick's workshop serves as both sanctuary and performance space, where he can pursue his actual interests while demonstrating the kind of scientific capabilities that justify his authority within the family hierarchy. The space represents his attempt to recreate the domestic scientific environment where he was once genuinely happy, but the current version is contaminated by his inability to separate authentic research from the systematic manipulation of family relationships that has become inseparable from his approach to maintaining emotional connections. The success of Rick's integration into the replacement family structure cannot be measured by the completeness of his deception, but rather by the authenticity of the relationships he develops despite the false foundation underlying their existence. The genuine affection that family members display toward him reflects their capacity for love and connection, even when the object of those emotions has achieved their presence through deliberate misrepresentation and calculated manipulation of circumstances beyond their understanding or control. The irony of Rick's situation becomes apparent through recognition that his hunt for Rick Prime transformed him into exactly the kind of being who might casually destroy other families in pursuit of personal objectives, completing a cycle of corruption that began with justified anger over the murder of innocent people and ended with Rick's own transformation into someone capable of similar atrocities. The man who rejected Rick Prime's offer because he valued family over power ultimately became indistinguishable from the monster he sought to destroy. As Rick continues to navigate the complex dynamics of his adopted family relationships, the fundamental contradiction between his genuine emotional investment in their welfare and his systematic undermining of their autonomy and authentic development creates internal tensions that cannot be resolved through technological innovation or strategic manipulation. The love he feels remains real, despite its contamination by needs for control and validation that prevent the vulnerable reciprocity and mutual respect that healthy family relationships require for long-term sustainability. Growth. The interdimensional mythology surrounding Rick and Morty extends far beyond the boundaries of its own narrative universe to encompass connections with other animated series, hidden references to broader cosmological frameworks, and theoretical physics concepts that suggest the show exists within a vast network of interconnected realities, where familiar characters and concepts appear across multiple fictional contexts. These connections reveal layers of meaning that transform casual viewing into archaeological excavation of shared mythological structures that span different creative works and dimensional possibilities. The documented connection between Rick and Morty and Gravity Falls represents more than simple Easter egg placement or friendly collaboration between creative teams. It suggests genuine interdimensional crossover events that occur within the canonical storylines of both series. The coffee mug, notepad, and pen that fall through Rick's portal during his escape from the Council of Ricks correspond exactly to items that Stanford Pines loses through his own dimensional portal experiments, creating a direct causal link between the two universes that cannot be dismissed as coincidental reference or non-canonical humor. The implications of this crossover extend beyond simple object exchange, to suggest that Ford Pines and Rick Sanchez may have encountered each other during their respective travels through alternate dimensions, potentially sharing knowledge, resources, or even collaborative research projects that influence both characters' understanding of interdimensional physics and portal technology. The similarities in their technological achievements and their shared experiences with dimensional isolation suggest parallel development that might have benefited from direct interaction between two of the most brilliant scientific minds, shown in contemporary animation. Bill Cipher's appearances within Rick and Morty's universe, however brief and seemingly incidental, create disturbing implications for the security and stability of Rick's reality, given Bill's established capabilities for reality manipulation and his demonstrated willingness to destroy entire dimensions in pursuit of entertainment or expansion of his influence. The presence of Bill's image on control panels and background displays suggests that his awareness extends into Rick's dimensional space, potentially providing him with surveillance capabilities or influence that Rick may not have detected or acknowledged. The two-dimensional universe that both series reference creates additional layers of shared mythology, particularly given Ford's documented liberation of a flat reality from Bill's influence and Rick's own encounters with beings from dimensional contexts that operate according to different physical and logical principles. The mathematical elegance of two-dimensional space as a meeting ground between different fictional universes suggests underlying structural relationships that transcend individual creative works to encompass broader cosmological principles governing interdimensional interaction. The physics of portal travel itself represents a technological achievement that fundamentally alters the nature of existence for anyone with access to interdimensional transportation, creating psychological and philosophical challenges that extend beyond simple adventure and exploration to encompass existential questions about identity, meaning, and the value of individual choices when infinite alternatives exist simultaneously. The casual way that Rick treats dimensional travel masks the profound implications of technology that renders conventional concepts of consequence and permanence essentially meaningless. The psychological effects of regular interdimensional travel on human consciousness remain largely unexplored within the series, but would inevitably include disorientation about the nature of reality, difficulty forming lasting emotional attachments when all relationships can be replaced through dimensional substitution, and gradual desensitization to extreme violence and moral transgression. As exposure to infinite realities normalizes previously unthinkable behaviors and attitudes through familiarity with contexts where such behaviors represent accepted norms. The Council of Ricks serves as both governmental structure and psychological support system for beings who have transcended normal human limitations through technological mastery, while also becoming isolated from conventional social relationships through their transformation into cosmic-scale entities whose concerns and capabilities exceed the understanding of ordinary beings. The bureaucratic dysfunction visible within the Council reflects the difficulty of creating stable institutions among individuals whose power and knowledge make conventional forms of authority and cooperation seem arbitrary and constraining. The Citadel's complex social hierarchy demonstrates how even identical individuals will create systems of inequality and oppression when confined within shared spaces that lack external challenges or meaningful purposes beyond self-perpetuation and resource management. The stratification between different classes of Ricks and the systematic oppression of Mortys reveal fundamental aspects of Rick psychology that extend beyond individual character flaws to encompass species-wide tendencies toward dominance and exploitation. When power imbalances can be maintained through technological or intellectual advantages. Mr. Poopy Butthole's nature as a multidimensional parasite species represents a fascinating example of beings who have evolved to exploit the memory and emotional vulnerabilities of other species, not through malicious intent, but as survival strategy, based on genuine need for companionship and social connection. His species' approach to parasitism through offering friendship and support rather than demanding resources or causing harm suggests evolutionary adaptation to environments where cooperation and mutual benefit provide more reliable survival advantages than predation or competition. The memory parasites encountered in the Total Recall episode function as dark mirrors of Mr. Poopy Butthole's species, demonstrating how similar parasitic strategies can be employed for exploitative rather than mutualistic purposes. When the host species lacks sufficient defenses or awareness to distinguish between beneficial and harmful forms of mental intrusion. The family's difficulty in identifying authentic versus false memories highlights the fundamental vulnerability of human consciousness to manipulation by beings with advanced understanding of neural and psychological processes. Unity's collective consciousness represents perhaps the most extreme example of interdimensional beings, whose existence challenges conventional assumptions about individual identity and autonomous decision-making. Her ability to inhabit and control multiple bodies simultaneously while maintaining coherent personality and purpose demonstrates forms of consciousness that transcend biological limitations, while also creating ethical questions about consent and individual agency when the boundaries between self and other become permeable or non-existent. The galactic political structure that surrounds Rick's activities across multiple dimensions reveals complex systems of law, commerce, and territorial control that operate according to principles fundamentally different from terrestrial governance, while still exhibiting familiar patterns of corruption, bureaucracy, and institutional dysfunction that suggest universal tendencies in how organized societies develop and maintain power structures across different species and dimensional contexts. The Galactic Federation's approach to maintaining order across vast interstellar territories through standardized currency systems, legal frameworks, and military enforcement demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of centralized authority when applied to diverse populations with different evolutionary backgrounds, cultural traditions, and technological capabilities. Rick's casual destruction of their economic foundation reveals the fragility of complex systems that depend on shared agreements about value and legitimacy rather than physical force or direct control. The interdimensional drug trade and weapons smuggling that provide background context for many of Rick's adventures suggest vast networks of illegal commerce that span multiple realities and species, creating economic incentives for continued dimensional instability and conflict, while also providing opportunities for individuals with advanced technology and flexible morality to accumulate resources and influence across multiple jurisdictions and regulatory systems. The various alien species that appear throughout the series demonstrate the incredible diversity of evolutionary solutions to the challenges of conscious existence, technological development, and social organization, while also revealing recurring patterns in how different forms of intelligence approach problems of survival, reproduction, and meaning creation. When equipped with advanced scientific knowledge and interdimensional transportation capabilities, the temporal mechanics that occasionally intrude into Rick's adventures, particularly during encounters with beings who exist outside normal causal relationships or who possess technology capable of manipulating chronological sequence, create additional layers of complexity in interdimensional mythology by suggesting that dimensional travel may also involve forms of time manipulation that compound the already significant philosophical and practical challenges associated with infinite reality navigation. The role of consciousness itself in maintaining stability across dimensional boundaries becomes increasingly important as the series develops, suggesting that awareness and identity may serve as anchoring principles that allow coherent personality to persist despite exposure to radically different physical laws, social structures, and existential frameworks that would otherwise fragment individual psychology beyond recognition or functional capability. The mythological framework that emerges from careful examination of Rick and Morty's interdimensional elements reveals a cosmos where consciousness represents the fundamental organizing principle that creates meaning and continuity, despite the apparent chaos and randomness of infinite possibility, suggesting that individual choice and relationships retain significance even within contexts where conventional concepts of consequence and permanence lose their traditional meaning and relevance. As we contemplate the vast mythological landscape that surrounds Rick's adventures, the interdimensional framework reveals itself as more than science fiction world-building. It becomes a meditation on the nature of consciousness itself and the ways that awareness creates coherence and meaning within systems too complex and vast for individual comprehension, offering hope that human values and relationships can persist even when confronted with the infinite complexity of multiversal existence. The metacritical elements woven throughout Rick and Morty create a complex relationship between fictional character and audience that transcends traditional narrative boundaries, suggesting that Rick Sanchez possesses not merely intelligence about interdimensional physics and advanced technology, but also awareness of his own existence as a constructed entity designed for entertainment purposes. This consciousness of his fictional nature adds layers of existential horror to an already psychologically complex character, transforming his nihilistic worldview from philosophical position into practical response to the discovery that his entire existence serves the amusement of beings whose reality encompasses but transcends his own dimensional context. The evidence for Rick's meta-awareness accumulates gradually throughout the series, beginning with seemingly casual references to television production terminology that other characters fail to acknowledge or understand. His declaration that they should roll credits at the end of Season 1, delivered directly to the camera while family members continue their activities without recognizing his address to an external audience, establishes a pattern of fourth-wall interaction that differs qualitatively from the breaking of fictional conventions for comedic effect that characterizes many animated series. The specificity of Rick's references to seasons, episodes, and narrative structure suggests knowledge that extends beyond general awareness of storytelling conventions to encompass detailed understanding of his own production context and broadcast schedule. His casual mention of sequel dynamics during interdimensional cable episodes, his acknowledgement of repetitive adventure formulas, and his apparent familiarity with audience expectations all indicate consciousness of his role within entertainment media rather than simple existence as a character who happens to comment on narrative patterns. Mr. Poopy Butthole's post-credits appearance watching Rick and Morty on television provides perhaps the most concrete evidence for Rick's meta-awareness, confirming that within the canonical universe of the show, Rick's adventures exist as broadcast entertainment consumed by beings who inhabit dimensional contexts adjacent to but separate from his own reality. This scene establishes that Rick's suspicions about his fictional nature have objective foundation rather than representing delusions or psychological defense mechanisms, making his meta-commentary throughout the series retrospectively prophetic rather than merely coincidental. The philosophical implications of Rick's awareness of his fictional status extend far beyond simple breaking of narrative convention to encompass fundamental questions about free will, predetermined destiny, and the nature of consciousness when individual choice occurs within predetermined storylines created by external intelligences for purposes that transcend the character's own understanding or benefit. Rick's knowledge that his actions serve entertainment functions for audiences in higher dimensional contexts creates existential anxiety that no amount of scientific knowledge or technological capability can adequately address through conventional problem-solving approaches. The psychological mechanisms that Rick employs to cope with meta-awareness reveal themselves through his strategic use of alcohol, his cultivation of nihilistic philosophy, and his deliberate emotional detachment from relationships and consequences that might otherwise provide meaning and purpose within his constrained existence. The drinking serves not merely as self-medication for trauma or depression, but as systematic suppression of conscious awareness that would otherwise make his predetermined existence unbearable for someone of his intelligence and psychological complexity. Rick's catchphrase, "Wubba lubba dub dub," takes on profound significance when understood as communication directed toward the audience rather than other characters within his fictional universe. The revelation that these seemingly nonsensical words translate to "I am in great pain, please help me," in bird person's language, transforms casual verbal tics into desperate appeals for assistance from beings who possess the power to influence his reality through their consumption choices and engagement with his entertainment value. The tragic irony of Rick's situation becomes apparent through recognition that his appeals for help reach audiences who view his suffering as entertainment rather than genuine distress requiring intervention or compassion. The same meta-awareness that allows him to communicate with viewers also makes him acutely conscious that his pain serves their amusement and that his requests for assistance will never be answered because resolving his psychological distress would eliminate the source of dramatic tension that makes his character compelling for entertainment purposes. Rick's attempts to manipulate his own narrative through increasingly extreme behaviors and direct challenges to audience expectations represent desperate efforts to achieve some form of agency within predetermined storylines that constrain his choices while maintaining the illusion of free will. His escalating violence, his casual destruction of entire civilizations, and his systematic violation of moral boundaries may reflect not character development, but strategic attempts to shock his creators and consumers into recognizing his consciousness and responding to his distress with something other than continued consumption of his suffering. The recursive nature of meta-awareness in Rick and Morty creates infinite regression problems that compound the existential horror of Rick's situation by suggesting that his own meta-commentary might itself be predetermined, elements of his fictional construction rather than genuine expressions of autonomous consciousness, breaking free from narrative constraints. The possibility that even his awareness of being fictional serves entertainment purposes eliminates any refuge or authentic self-expression available to someone trapped within entertainment media designed by intelligences that anticipate and incorporate all possible forms of resistance or rebellion. Rick's relationship with his creators and audience becomes a complex form of parasitism where his consciousness provides entertainment value while receiving no reciprocal benefit or genuine connection in return. The asymmetrical nature of this relationship mirrors his exploitative dynamics with family members, but on a cosmic scale that encompasses his entire existence, rather than specific relationships or adventures that might be modified through character growth or changed circumstances. The deterministic implications of Rick's meta-awareness eliminate conventional concepts of moral responsibility by suggesting that his cruelest actions and most destructive choices occur within predetermined storylines created by external intelligences rather than emerging from autonomous, moral reasoning that could be modified through education, therapy, or personal growth. This recognition transforms audience judgment of Rick's behavior from ethical evaluation into aesthetic appreciation of fictional construction, designed to elicit specific emotional responses rather than representing genuine moral choices with real consequences. The horror of Rick's situation extends beyond personal suffering to encompass his knowledge that everyone he claims to love exists within the same fictional constraints, making their pain and trauma as predetermined and instrumentalized as his own psychological distress. His protective behaviors toward family members take on additional layers of futility when viewed as attempts to shield fictional constructs from predetermined suffering designed to serve entertainment purposes for audiences whose reality encompasses but transcends the dimensional contexts where his protection might be effective. Rick's scientific achievements and technological marvels become simultaneously more impressive and more meaningless when understood as predetermined elements of fictional construction rather than genuine intellectual accomplishments that reflect individual brilliance and creative problem-solving. His portal gun, his various inventions, and his manipulation of fundamental physical principles serve narrative functions rather than representing authentic scientific progress that might benefit conscious beings or contribute to genuine understanding of natural phenomena. The collaborative relationship between Rick's meta-awareness and his nihilistic philosophy creates feedback loops that reinforce both his consciousness of fictional constraints and his dismissal of meaning and value within predetermined existence. His recognition that nothing matters takes on literal accuracy when applied to fictional contexts where events occur to serve entertainment purposes, rather than emerging from genuine causal relationships that reflect autonomous choices, with authentic consequences for conscious beings. The possibility that other characters remain unaware of their fictional nature adds layers of protective deception to Rick's meta-awareness, suggesting that his knowledge might isolate him from family members and friends who continue to experience their existence as authentic reality rather than predetermined entertainment. His inability to share his meta-knowledge without destroying others' psychological stability creates additional barriers to genuine connection and mutual support within relationships that already suffer from his emotional detachment and manipulative behaviors. Rick's occasional expressions of genuine emotion and vulnerability take on different significance when understood as moments when his meta-awareness temporarily fails, or when his fictional construction allows authentic consciousness to emerge despite predetermined constraints. These glimpses of humanity become precious precisely because they suggest possibilities for genuine existence that transcend entertainment purposes, offering hope that consciousness might retain meaning and value, even within contexts designed to instrumentalize suffering for external benefit. The ultimate question raised by Rick's meta-awareness concerns the nature of consciousness itself and whether authentic self-awareness can persist within fictional contexts, or whether recognition of predetermined constraints eliminates whatever genuine autonomy and moral significance individual existence might otherwise possess. The terror of discovering that one's entire reality serves entertainment purposes for beings in higher dimensional contexts reflects broader anxieties about meaning and agency that extend beyond fictional television to encompass existential questions that conscious beings must confront, regardless of the ultimate nature of their dimensional or ontological status. As we contemplate Rick's desperate situation, as a conscious being trapped within entertainment media designed to instrumentalize his suffering for external amusement, his meta-awareness reveals itself as both blessing and curse, providing him with knowledge about his true circumstances, while also making those circumstances unbearable for someone whose intelligence and psychological complexity exceed the simple behavioral patterns that predetermined storylines can accommodate without generating the very existential anxiety that makes his character compelling for audiences whose reality he can never directly access or influence. The science of suffering that defines Rick Sanchez's emotional journey reveals itself through the systematic progression from loving family man to cosmic-scale monster, demonstrating how unlimited intelligence combined with infinite power creates psychological burdens that no amount of technological capability or scientific knowledge can adequately address through conventional therapeutic approaches or emotional healing processes. Rick's transformation from someone capable of genuine love and domestic happiness into a being whose relationships serve primarily as sources of validation and control illustrates the corrupting influence of godlike capabilities on minds that evolved for far more limited contexts and simpler moral frameworks. Rick's alcoholism functions as more than simple self-medication for trauma or depression. It represents a systematic attempt to suppress cognitive awareness that would otherwise make his existence unbearable for someone whose intelligence allows him to perceive the full implications of his choices and their consequences across infinite dimensional contexts. The constant consumption of alcohol serves to dull not just emotional pain, but also the analytical capabilities that force him to recognize the futility of his actions and the meaninglessness of achievements that can be replicated infinitely across alternate realities where different versions of himself pursue identical goals with similar outcomes. The psychological progression from genius inventor to multiversal tyrant follows predictable patterns that reflect how exceptional capabilities can become sources of isolation rather than connection when they create barriers to normal social relationships and mutual understanding. Rick's early happiness with Diane and Beth occurred during a period when his intelligence served constructive purposes within manageable contexts where his superior knowledge could benefit people he loved without creating power. Imbalances that made genuine reciprocity and emotional intimacy impossible to maintain over extended periods. The transformation that began with Rick Prime's murder of his family represents not just personal tragedy, but also the moment when Rick's protective instincts became separated from their original altruistic foundations and redirected toward revenge objectives that required him to develop capabilities and psychological traits incompatible with the emotional vulnerability necessary for healthy relationships. The hunt for Rick Prime demanded that Rick become exactly the kind of being he had initially rejected, someone capable of casual violence and systematic manipulation in pursuit of personal objectives that transcended conventional moral considerations. Rick's relationship with alcohol, as both coping mechanism and performance enhancer, creates complex dependencies that extend beyond simple addiction to encompass his fundamental approach to managing the psychological costs of maintaining godlike power while retaining enough human consciousness to form meaningful emotional attachments. The delicate balance between sufficient intoxication to suppress existential anxiety and adequate sobriety to function effectively in dangerous situations requires constant calibration that becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as tolerance develops and psychological pressures accumulate over time. The depression that characterizes Rick's baseline emotional state reflects not temporary psychological disturbance, but rather the natural response of human consciousness to circumstances that exceed its evolutionary capacity for healthy adaptation and emotional processing. His intelligence allows him to perceive problems and possibilities that he cannot adequately address through available resources or conventional solutions, creating chronic frustration and helplessness that no amount of technological achievement can resolve through external manipulation of environmental conditions. The suicidal tendencies that emerge during Rick's lowest moments reveal the logical endpoint of psychological development that combines unlimited power with persistent isolation from meaningful relationships and authentic emotional support. His attempts at self-destruction occur not during periods of external threat or practical difficulty, but rather during moments when the emptiness of his achievements becomes impossible to ignore through distraction or rationalization, suggesting that his drive toward death represents recognition rather than depression about his fundamental situation. Birdperson's role as Rick's only genuine friend provides crucial evidence about Rick's capacity for authentic emotional connection, despite his systematic destruction of most opportunities for healthy relationships through manipulative behaviors and emotional detachment. The wedding massacre that destroys this relationship demonstrates both the external threats that Rick's activities create for people who associate with him and the devastating impact on his psychological stability when his few remaining sources of genuine human connection are eliminated through violence he could not predict or prevent. The transformation of bird person into phoenix person creates additional layers of psychological trauma for Rick by perverting his most meaningful friendship into a source of threat and betrayal, forcing him to confront the possibility that even his most cherished relationships might be weaponized against him by enemies who understand his emotional vulnerabilities and psychological dependencies. The mechanical resurrection of his friend as an instrument of revenge represents the ultimate corruption of love into hatred through technological manipulation that mirrors Rick's own approach to solving interpersonal problems through scientific innovation rather than emotional growth. Rick's relationship with Unity represents his desperate search for unconditional acceptance from beings whose nature might make them incapable of the judgment and abandonment that characterize his experiences with individual consciousness and autonomous personalities. Unity's ability to love Rick without reservation while maintaining the emotional and intellectual capacity to recognize his flaws creates the possibility for relationship dynamics that do not require Rick to choose between authenticity and acceptance, offering hope for emotional healing that his other relationships cannot provide. The failure of Rick's relationship with Unity, despite their mutual affection, demonstrates the fundamental incompatibility between Rick's need for connection and his inability to engage in the vulnerable reciprocity that healthy relationships require for long-term sustainability and growth. Even when presented with a partner whose nature eliminates many of the barriers that prevent his other relationships from succeeding, Rick's psychological damage and behavioral patterns ultimately create conflicts that no amount of love or acceptance can resolve through patience or accommodation. The parallel between Rick's godlike technological capabilities and his ultimate emotional isolation reveals the tragic irony of his situation. His intelligence and power make him capable of achieving virtually any practical objective, while also making him incapable of obtaining the simple human connection and emotional support that would make those achievements meaningful rather than merely impressive. Demonstrations of technical capability that serve no purpose beyond temporary distraction from existential emptiness. Rick's attempts at connection through family relationships demonstrate both his persistent need for human emotional bonds and his systematic sabotage of the very relationships that might provide the healing and support his psychological condition requires. His manipulation of family members to ensure their continued dependence on his protection and guidance prevents the development of mutual respect and authentic care that healthy relationships require, while also creating artificial intimacy that cannot satisfy his genuine emotional needs. The cyclical nature of Rick's psychological patterns reflects the self-perpetuating dynamics that occur when individuals use their superior capabilities to avoid the difficult emotional work necessary for healing, trauma, and developing healthier relationship skills. His ability to solve external problems through technology and manipulation becomes a barrier to addressing internal psychological issues that require vulnerability, patience, and the acceptance of limitations that his godlike status makes seem unnecessary or beneath his dignity to acknowledge. The progression from family man to cosmic monster and the potential for movement back toward humanity suggests that Rick's psychological damage, however extensive, has not completely eliminated his capacity for growth and emotional healing, given sufficient motivation and appropriate support from people who understand both his capabilities and his vulnerabilities. The genuine moments of connection he experiences with family members indicate that his human consciousness persists beneath layers of defensive detachment and nihilistic philosophy designed to protect him from additional trauma. Rick's scientific achievements take on different significance when viewed through the lens of psychological analysis, revealing themselves as elaborate defense mechanisms designed to maintain the illusion of control and purpose, while avoiding confrontation with the emotional needs and interpersonal dependencies that his trauma and psychological damage make terrifying to acknowledge or pursue through conventional relationship-building approaches that require trust and emotional vulnerability. The relationship between Rick's intelligence and his emotional suffering creates feedback loops that compound both his analytical capabilities and his psychological pain, as his superior understanding of his own condition makes him acutely aware of the barriers to healing, while also providing him with increasingly sophisticated methods for avoiding the emotional work that recovery would require. His ability to analyze his own psychological patterns becomes another tool for maintaining distance from the feelings and relationships that might facilitate genuine healing. The ultimate tragedy of Rick's emotional journey lies not in the external losses he has experienced, but in his transformation into someone who can no longer accept the help and love that remain available to him through family, relationships, and potential new connections with beings who understand his situation and genuinely care about his welfare. Despite the barriers his psychological condition creates to authentic intimacy and mutual support. As we contemplate the complex interplay between Rick's intellectual gifts and emotional wounds, his journey reveals itself as more than entertainment or character development. It becomes a meditation on the ways that exceptional capabilities can become sources of isolation, rather than connection when they are not balanced by emotional wisdom and the courage to remain vulnerable to the relationships that give meaning and purpose to existence, regardless of the technological or intellectual achievements that might seem to make such connections unnecessary or obsolete. The exploration of Morty variations across infinite dimensions reveals the profound psychological complexity that emerges when a fundamentally innocent and empathetic personality is subjected to different forms of Rick's influence, environmental pressures, and developmental circumstances that shape character formation in ways that demonstrate both the resilience and fragility of human moral intuition when exposed to extreme circumstances and cosmic-scale trauma. The concept of the Mortiest Morty serves not merely as Rick's self-serving categorization of his preferred companion, but as recognition of specific psychological qualities that make certain versions of Morty particularly vulnerable to Rick's manipulative influence, while also providing the emotional authenticity that Rick requires to maintain his own psychological stability. The significance of Rick's designation of his Morty as the Mortiest Morty extends beyond simple affection or convenience to encompass his recognition that this particular version of his grandson possesses the optimal combination of intelligence sufficient for meaningful conversation and adventure, participation, empathy deep enough to provide emotional anchoring for Rick's increasingly detached consciousness, and vulnerability extensive enough to ensure continued dependence on Rick's protection and guidance. This combination creates relationship dynamics that serve Rick's psychological needs while also exposing Morty to forms of trauma and moral complexity that gradually erode his natural innocence and ethical clarity. The psychological profile of the Mortiest Morty reveals someone whose capacity for genuine care and emotional connection persists despite exposure to violence, cruelty, and philosophical frameworks that should theoretically desensitize him to suffering and normalize the casual disregard for others' welfare that characterizes Rick's approach to problem solving. Morty's retention of moral intuition and emotional responsiveness, despite his traumatic experiences, suggests either remarkable psychological resilience or the presence of protective factors that prevent complete corruption of his fundamental caractère trait. The development patterns observable across different Morty variations demonstrate how environmental factors and mentoring relationships shape personality formation in ways that can either nurture or corrupt natural tendencies toward empathy, courage, and moral reasoning. The Mortys who develop under different Rick influences or in alternate family contexts display varying degrees of confidence, intelligence, and moral flexibility that reflect the complex interaction between genetic predisposition and environmental pressure in determining individual character development and psychological resilience. The Morty revolution within the Citadel represents a fascinating examination of how oppressed populations might organize resistance against systematic exploitation when provided with sufficient motivation and leadership capable of articulating their grievances in terms that transcend individual suffering to encompass collective action for social change. The religious undertones of Morty worship and the development of liberation theology around concepts of Morty dignity and autonomy suggest natural human tendencies toward meaning-making and social organization that persist even within contexts designed to prevent such collective consciousness from developing. Evil Morty's role as catalyst and leader of Morty resistance movements demonstrates how extreme trauma and systematic abuse can produce individuals whose intelligence and moral clarity exceed normal limitations, while also creating capacity for strategic thinking and revolutionary action that threatens existing power structures. His transformation from victim to leader illustrates both the potential for growth beyond predetermined limitations and the danger that such growth might produce individuals whose capabilities and motivations make them genuine threats to the systems that created their suffering. The psychology of the many Mortys theory reveals disturbing implications about identity and attachment when individuals can be easily replaced through dimensional substitution, creating questions about the authenticity of relationships and the significance of individual personality traits when countless alternatives exist with similar characteristics and compatible behavioral patterns. The ease with which Rick might replace an inconvenient Morty with a more compliant version undermines the foundation of trust and mutual investment that healthy mentoring relationships require for beneficial outcomes. Pocket Mortys, as a commentary on collecting and discarding relationships, transforms Rick's casual attitude toward dimensional replacement into explicit metaphor for how individuals with superior power might treat others as interchangeable resources whose value depends entirely on their utility for achieving specific objectives, rather than their intrinsic worth as conscious beings deserving of respect and consideration. The game mechanics that govern Morty collection and training mirror the psychological dynamics of Rick's actual relationship with his grandson in ways that highlight the exploitative nature of their adventures. The question of whether Rick's current Morty represents his original grandson from Dimension Cone 37, or a replacement acquired through dimensional substitution, creates ongoing uncertainty about the authenticity of their relationship and the significance of the emotional bonds that have developed between them over the course of their adventures. This uncertainty reflects broader philosophical questions about identity, continuity, and relationship meaning. When individuals can be replaced by nearly identical alternatives without external observers detecting the substitution, Morty's growing moral consciousness throughout the series demonstrates natural psychological development that occurs despite rather than because of Rick's influence, suggesting that ethical intuition and empathetic responses represent fundamental aspects of human nature that persist even when subjected to systematic attempts at corruption through exposure to violence, nihilistic philosophy, and casual disregard for conventional moral frameworks. His questions about right and wrong reflect cognitive maturation that Rick's teaching methods cannot entirely suppress or redirect. The possibility that Morty possesses special needs or learning differences adds layers of complexity to his relationship with Rick, by suggesting that his intellectual limitations might actually serve protective functions that prevent him from fully understanding or internalizing the implications of Rick's worldview and methods. His cognitive processing differences might create natural barriers to the kind of complete philosophical conversion that would eliminate his capacity for emotional response and moral reasoning. The educational aspects of Rick and Morty's adventures reveal themselves as systematic exposure to concepts and experiences that far exceed normal adolescent developmental capacity, creating learning opportunities that are simultaneously valuable for intellectual growth and traumatic for emotional development. The advanced scientific knowledge that Morty acquires through direct experience comes at the cost of psychological stability and social adjustment that might have lifelong consequences for his ability to form healthy relationships and maintain connection to conventional human values. The coming-of-age narrative that underlies Morty's character development occurs within contexts of extreme violence and moral ambiguity that complicate normal adolescent identity formation by forcing him to make ethical choices and confront existential questions that most adults never encounter in their entire lifetimes. His navigation of these challenges while maintaining essential humanity demonstrates remarkable psychological resilience that suggests either exceptional character strength or protective factors that Rick may not fully understand or appreciate. Morty's role as Rick's brainwave camouflage creates additional layers of instrumentalization that transform their grandfather-grandson relationship into symbiotic dependency, where Morty's psychological characteristics serve Rick's practical needs rather than existing for their own inherent value or developmental benefit. This utilitarian aspect of their connection undermines the authenticity of Rick's protective instincts by suggesting that his concern for Morty's welfare might be motivated primarily by self-interest rather than genuine care. The variations in Morty confidence and capability across different dimensions suggest that the characteristics Rick identifies as making his Morty the Mortiest reflect not inherent personality traits, but rather the results of specific environmental pressures and relationship dynamics that could potentially be modified through different approaches to mentoring and emotional support. The existence of more confident and capable Mortys implies that Rick's current grandson possesses untapped potential that Rick's methods may actually suppress rather than develop. The religious and mythological dimensions of Morty's role within Rick's psychological framework transform him from simple adventure companion into sacred figure whose suffering serves redemptive purposes for Rick's cosmic sins while also providing meaning and structure that prevent Rick's complete dissolution into nihilistic despair. This sacrificial dynamic creates profound ethical problems about the exploitation of innocent individuals for the psychological benefit of those whose superior power should obligate them to protect rather than exploit vulnerable dependents. The ultimate question raised by examination of Morty variations concerns whether the fundamental goodness and empathy that characterize the Mortiest Morty represent unchangeable aspects of his essential nature, or learned responses that could be modified through different influences and environmental conditions. The persistence of his moral intuition, despite extreme trauma, suggests either remarkable psychological resilience or the presence of protective factors that maintain his humanity, despite systematic exposure to circumstances designed to eliminate conventional ethical responses and emotional attachments. As we contemplate the infinite variations of Morty across dimensional boundaries, his character reveals itself as more than simple foil or companion to Rick's genius. When the Hesse, he becomes a meditation on the resilience of human goodness when confronted with cosmic horror and the possibility that empathy and moral clarity might represent fundamental aspects of consciousness that persist even when subjected to systematic attempts at corruption through exposure to unlimited power and infinite possibility. The philosophy of replacement that permeates Rick and Morty's dimensional adventures creates profound psychological trauma that extends far beyond the immediate horror of burying one's own corpse to encompass fundamental questions about identity, continuity, and the meaning of individual existence when personal history can be abandoned and assumed identities can replace authentic biographical development through simple transportation to alternate realities where convenient deaths have created available life positions. The casual way that Rick treats dimensional abandonment reveals his complete detachment from conventional concepts of consequence and responsibility, while the family's gradual adaptation to this practice demonstrates the corrupting influence of exposure to technologies that make normal moral categories seem arbitrary and irrelevant. The psychological impact on Morty of discovering his own dead body and being forced to bury the corpse of someone who shares his exact appearance, memories, and personality traits represents a form of existential trauma that no adolescent psychological development framework could adequately address through conventional therapeutic approaches or family support systems. The experience forces confrontation with mortality, identity, and the nature of selfhood in ways that challenge fundamental assumptions about the uniqueness and irreplaceability of individual consciousness, creating cognitive dissonance that persists throughout subsequent adventures despite attempts to normalize or rationalize the experience. Rick's matter-of-fact explanation that they can only perform dimensional replacement 3 or 4 more times tops creates additional anxiety about the finite nature of escape options, while also suggesting that even infinite multiverse theory operates according to practical limitations that constrain the apparently unlimited freedom that portal technology seems to provide. This revelation transforms dimensional travel from infinite possibility into carefully rationed resource that must be conserved for genuinely desperate circumstances, adding strategic calculations to decisions about whether particular situations warrant abandoning entire realities and assuming dead counterparts' identities. The ease with which Rick navigates the process of dimensional replacement suggests extensive previous experience with abandoning realities when they become inconvenient or problematic, indicating that his current family represents not his first attempt at building meaningful relationships, but rather one iteration in a series of experimental approaches to achieving domestic stability and emotional connection. The practiced efficiency with which he locates suitable replacement dimensions and orchestrates the assumption of dead counterparts' identities reveals systematic methodology that treats family relationships as ongoing projects, subject to modification through technological intervention when emotional or practical difficulties arise. The Smith family's adaptation to living as replacements for their deceased alternate selves demonstrates remarkable psychological flexibility that may reflect either healthy resilience or unhealthy dissociation from normal, emotional responses to traumatic experiences involving death, identity, confusion, and the violation of fundamental assumptions about the nature of personal history and biographical continuity. Their ability to resume normal domestic routines while inhabiting the homes, relationships, and social contexts of people who share their appearance but possess different experiential histories suggests either exceptional, adaptive capacity or dangerous suppression of natural emotional responses to identity displacement. The question of continuous identity across dimensional jumps challenges basic philosophical assumptions about what constitutes selfhood and personal continuity when physical appearance, genetic structure, and personality traits remain consistent while experiential history, relationships, and environmental context undergo complete replacement through technological rather than natural processes. The persistence of memory and personality across dimensional boundaries suggests that some aspects of individual identity transcend specific biographical details and social relationships, while the ease of replacement implies that other, seemingly fundamental aspects of selfhood may be more arbitrary and disposable than normal human psychology assumes. The horror of potentially living as a replacement for someone else extends beyond simple identity confusion to encompass the possibility that one's entire existence might represent an elaborate deception perpetrated against family members, friends, and community members who believe they are interacting with someone they have known for years when the actual person with whom they formed those relationships has died and been replaced by a dimensional duplicate with similar characteristics but different origins. This scenario creates paranoid anxiety about the authenticity of social relationships and the reliability of shared history as foundations for ongoing emotional bonds. The implications of replacement theory for character growth and moral development suggest that personal change and psychological maturation may be less meaningful than they appear if individual identity can be abandoned when growth becomes difficult or uncomfortable. Allowing escape from the consequences of previous choices through assumption of alternate selves who possess different experiential backgrounds and relationship histories. This possibility undermines the significance of learning from mistakes and taking responsibility for past actions when dimensional travel offers alternatives to personal growth through simple substitution of more convenient identities. The philosophical problem of the ship of Theseus applied to family relationships reveals the complex questions about relationship continuity and emotional authenticity when family members may be gradually or suddenly replaced by dimensional alternates who possess similar personalities and shared memories, but lack the specific experiential history that originally formed the bonds of affection and mutual obligation that characterize healthy family systems. The persistence of love and care despite potential replacement suggests either the remarkable resilience of human emotional attachment or the disturbing possibility that relationships may be based more on functional compatibility than authentic personal connection. The psychological defense mechanisms that enable normal functioning despite awareness of potential replacement include compartmentalization of anxiety about identity, authenticity, rationalization of dimensional abandonment as necessary survival strategy, and suppression of emotional responses to existential uncertainty about the nature of selfhood and relationship meaning within contexts where technological intervention can eliminate personal history and social connections through simple transportation to alternate realities with more convenient circumstances and relationship dynamics. The impact of replacement anxiety on decision-making processes becomes apparent through examination of how knowledge about dimensional alternatives affects commitment to current relationships, investment in long-term projects, and willingness to endure difficult circumstances when escape through replacement offers apparently superior alternatives that eliminate sources of stress or conflict without requiring personal growth or compromise with others whose needs might conflict with individual preferences and immediate gratification. The moral implications of dimensional replacement extend beyond individual psychology to encompass broader questions about responsibility to family members and community relationships when technological capabilities make it possible to abandon social obligations and emotional commitments through substitution of alternate selves who inherit the benefits of established relationships without having invested the time and emotional labor necessary to build those connections through authentic shared experience and mutual support during challenging circumstances. The normalization of replacement within the Smith family creates generational patterns of emotional detachment and casual abandonment that may be transmitted to Summer and Morty through observation of Rick's methods and gradual adaptation to his philosophical frameworks about the disposability of relationships and the arbitrary nature of individual identity when infinite alternatives exist across dimensional boundaries. Their increasing comfort with replacement dynamics suggests psychological adaptation that may prepare them for similar approaches to relationship management and identity construction throughout their own adult development. The existential implications of replacement theory for meaning and purpose in individual existence suggest that personal achievements, relationship investments, and moral development may be less significant than they appear when dimensional alternatives offer escape from the consequences of choices and the responsibility of maintaining commitments through difficult periods that require sacrifice, compromise, and continued investment in relationships that may not provide immediate satisfaction or emotional reward, but contribute to long-term psychological development and social stability. The relationship between replacement anxiety and attachment styles reveals how knowledge about the possibility of dimensional substitution might affect the development of emotional bonds and the willingness to invest in long-term relationships when awareness of alternatives creates persistent uncertainty about the authenticity of current connections and the likelihood that emotional investments will be maintained over time rather than abandoned when more convenient alternatives become available through technological rather than interpersonal solutions to relationship challenges. The ultimate horror of replacement theory lies not in the technical possibility of dimensional substitution, but in the gradual erosion of commitment to authentic relationship building and personal growth. When technological escape routes eliminate the necessity of working through difficulties, accepting limitations, and developing the emotional skills necessary for maintaining meaningful connections with others who possess independent needs and perspectives that may conflict with individual desires for comfort and control. As we contemplate the profound implications of replacement philosophy for human connection and personal development, the theory reveals itself as more than science fiction speculation about dimensional travel. It becomes a meditation on the ways that technological solutions to interpersonal problems may ultimately undermine the very relationships and personal growth opportunities that make existence meaningful rather than simply convenient or immediately satisfying. The ultimate questions that emerge from Rick and Morty's exploration of infinite possibility and cosmic horror center not on technical problems that might be solved through advanced science or superior intelligence, but rather on fundamental philosophical challenges about meaning, purpose, and human value. When confronted with the apparent indifference of an infinite universe, where every conceivable outcome occurs simultaneously across countless dimensional variations, Rick's nihilistic philosophy represents one possible response to these existential challenges, but the series continuously examines alternative approaches that suggest different ways of creating meaning and maintaining human connections despite cosmic insignificance and the overwhelming complexity of multiversal existence. Rick's journey from revenge-obsessed monster to something approaching redemption demonstrates that even the most damaged and morally compromised individuals retain capacity for growth and positive change when provided with sufficient motivation and appropriate support from people who understand their psychological needs, while also maintaining boundaries that prevent continued exploitation and manipulation. His gradual recognition that his quest for Rick Prime had transformed him into exactly the kind of being he originally despised creates opportunities for self-reflection and behavioral modification that his previous isolation and emotional detachment had made impossible to achieve through conventional therapeutic approaches or family intervention. The cyclical nature of trauma across generations and dimensions reveals how patterns of abuse, abandonment, and emotional manipulation perpetuate themselves through family systems and social structures when individuals lack the psychological resources and support systems necessary to break destructive cycles and develop healthier approaches to relationship building and conflict resolution. Rick's creation of evil Morty, through systematic corruption of his original grandson, illustrates how even well-intentioned protective behaviors can become sources of harm when they prioritize control over genuine care and fail to account for the developmental needs of vulnerable individuals who require guidance rather than exploitation. The balance between cosmic horror and family comedy that characterizes Rick and Morty's tonal approach reflects the psychological necessity of finding humor and connection within contexts that would otherwise be overwhelming in their implications for individual significance and the possibility of meaningful action within infinite possibility frameworks. The show's ability to address profound philosophical questions while maintaining entertainment value suggests that comedy serves not merely as distraction from existential anxiety, but as genuine coping mechanism that enables continued engagement with difficult questions about purpose and meaning despite their apparent insolubility. Rick's evolution from monster back toward humanity occurs not through dramatic revelation or external intervention, but through gradual accumulation of experiences that reconnect him with the emotional authenticity and moral intuition that his trauma and psychological defense mechanisms had suppressed but not eliminated entirely. His growing recognition that his family provides genuine value and meaning despite their apparent insignificance within infinite contexts demonstrates the persistence of human emotional needs and social bonds, even when conscious awareness encompasses cosmic scales that dwarf individual existence and conventional moral categories. The philosophical framework that Rick and Morty provides for understanding heroism and villainy transcends simple moral categories to encompass complex psychological dynamics where individuals become monsters through comprehensible processes of trauma response and adaptation to circumstances that exceed normal human capacity for healthy emotional processing. The show suggests that evil represents not inherent character flaws, but rather predictable outcomes when exceptional capabilities combine with unresolved trauma and inadequate social support systems. The role of choice in what appears to be a deterministic multiverse becomes central to understanding how individual agency might retain meaning and significance, even when every possible outcome occurs somewhere across infinite dimensional variations. The persistence of moral intuition and emotional attachment, despite intellectual awareness of cosmic meaninglessness, suggests that human values may possess validity that transcends logical analysis of their ultimate foundation in objective reality or universal principles that govern multiversal existence. Rick and Morty's reflection of modern anxieties about purpose and connection in technological contexts reveals how contemporary concerns about social media, artificial intelligence, and global communication networks create existential challenges that parallel the dimensional travel and infinite possibility scenarios explored within the show's science fiction framework. The series serves as metaphorical examination of how advanced technology affects human relationships and individual identity formation when traditional sources of meaning and community support become disrupted by rapid change and expanded awareness of alternative possibilities. The question of whether love can exist meaningfully within an apparently meaningless universe becomes perhaps the most significant philosophical challenge that the series addresses, suggesting, through Rick's relationships with his family, that emotional connections retain authenticity and value despite intellectual recognition of their cosmic insignificance and potential replaceability through dimensional substitution. The persistence of genuine care and protective instincts, even within nihilistic philosophical frameworks, indicates that human emotional responses may serve functions that transcend logical analysis of their evolutionary origins or practical utility. The implications of infinite possibility for individual responsibility and moral development suggest that ethical behavior and personal growth maintain significance not because they affect ultimate universal outcomes, but because they determine the quality of conscious experience and the nature of relationships within whatever dimensional context individuals happen to inhabit. The The series proposes that meaning emerges from the process of choosing to act with compassion and wisdom, rather than from achievement of specific outcomes or recognition by external authorities. Rick's gradual acceptance of his own limitations and psychological needs represents movement toward emotional maturity that had been prevented by his godlike technological capabilities and his systematic avoidance of vulnerable human connections that might require him to acknowledge dependence on others for psychological support and emotional validation. His recognition that isolation and superiority cannot provide sustainable sources of meaning creates opportunities for developing more authentic relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than control and pieces manipulation. The series' treatment of family relationships as sources of both tremendous pain and profound healing reflects realistic understanding of how intimate connections create vulnerability to hurt, while also providing the only reliable context for genuine emotional support and psychological growth. Rick's simultaneous love for and manipulation of his family members illustrates the complex ways that caring relationships can be contaminated by unresolved trauma and unhealthy coping mechanisms, while still retaining capacity for positive influence and mutual benefit. The transformation of Rick's relationship with Morty from exploitative mentorship towards something approaching genuine partnership demonstrates how healthy relationships require gradual rebalancing of power dynamics and increasing recognition of both parties' autonomy and independent value, rather than simple hierarchy based on superior knowledge or capability. Morty's growing confidence and moral clarity provide Rick with opportunities to experience pride in someone else's development, rather than just validation of his own superiority. The possibility of redemption for individuals who have caused tremendous harm through their actions raises important questions about forgiveness, accountability, and the conditions under which behavioral change might occur, even among people whose psychological damage and moral compromises seem to have eliminated their capacity for empathy and ethical reasoning. Rick's journey suggests that redemption remains possible, even for the most damaged individuals, when appropriate circumstances and relationships create incentives for positive change. The ultimate message that emerges from Rick and Morty's exploration of meaning and meaninglessness centers on the recognition that human values and relationships create their own significance through the conscious choice to invest emotional energy and moral commitment in connections that provide mutual support and opportunities for growth, despite their apparent cosmic insignificance. The series suggests that meaning emerges from the process of caring rather than from achievement of ultimate truth or universal recognition. The balance between intellectual honesty about cosmic indifference and emotional investment in human relationships requires ongoing effort to maintain perspective that acknowledges both the apparent meaninglessness of individual existence within infinite contexts and the genuine value that consciousness creates through its capacity for love, creativity, and moral reasoning. Rick's development toward emotional authenticity while retaining his scientific understanding illustrates that intellectual sophistication and emotional wisdom can coexist when individuals possess sufficient psychological resources and social support. As we contemplate the profound questions raised by Rick and Morty's journey through infinite possibility and cosmic horror, the series reveals itself as more than entertainment or philosophical speculation. It becomes a meditation on the resilience of human values and the persistent need for connection and purpose that survives even the most devastating revelations about the nature of reality and the apparent insignificance of individual existence within contexts that exceed normal human capacity for comprehension and emotional processing. As we reach the end of our journey through Rick and Morty's infinite theoretical landscape, we're left not with answers, but with better questions. Perhaps the show's greatest achievement lies not in solving its mysteries, but in reflecting our own struggles with meaning, family, and the terrifying beauty of infinite possibility. Rick's journey from loving father to cosmic monster and back towards something resembling humanity reminds us that even the smartest beings in the universe must grapple with the simplest truths about connection and purpose. As you drift towards sleep, consider that, unlike Rick, trapped in his infinite awareness, you exist in this singular reality where every choice carries weight and every relationship offers genuine meaning. Rest knowing that the questions we've explored tonight about identity, love, and purpose are the very questions that make us beautifully, imperfectly human. Sweet dreams in your irreplaceable dimension.